Thanks, April. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about transformative adaptation, TRAD for short. We're bringing this to the Starlings and others here tonight because we are aware that you're already doing a lot of this work. Midway through the pandemic, the stark realisation of the magnitude of the climate and ecological collapse has hit many of us anew. It has begun and it's speeding up. Many rebels have fallen away in grief and despair, and many who are still working away are losing heart. We recognise that our story has evolved and we need to evolve with it. There are different projects that have emerged to address this story change within XR. TRAD is one of them. TRAD has come about because one constant thread we are seeing is a longing to begin the work to act now on system change, that we can wait no longer. The theory of change that XR has been using is not enough. We need to be doing actions that hold the solutions within them. We need to embody the transformation that we aim to bring. Our focus on roadblocks and mass arrests doesn't feel sufficient, and we think it's partly because it's not satisfying this longing within many rebel hearts, and we are losing them. But we can come together to start the repair and resilience work ourselves, whilst still applying the pressure our rebellions bring to bear on government. We can model the society we wish to see. We can start building community resilience from the ground up, ignoring governments as much as we can. We can reach out to all the other groups in our communities who have been campaigning for decades. We can bring together social justice groups and environmental groups and work together towards our vision for the future. We can lend our talent for drama and flair by bringing the spotlight to their existing campaigns with our NVDA. We bring together a coalition of people united in their love and commitment to each other and the earth to begin a process of care, restoration, and changed relationship with the planet and each other. TRAD also provides a regenerative place for all of those passive rebels on our mailing lists and those dropping from our ranks in despair. I'd like to finish this intro by reading a brief story by one of our members, Chris Taylor. He's not here tonight. It's called Tomorrow's Story. There's a tale that's told around fires in the future. It goes something like this. It was the time of the great unravelling, when the greatest schemes and plans of puffed up men were playing out, as anyone with any sense knew they would. Hills and trees and Earth's precious minerals were being devoured ever faster. Rivers and seas were filled with a toxic soup, the waves knee-deep in plastic pieces. There was not a corner of the world that could escape the onslaught. As the clock ticked on the shelf, each tock sounded the death of another animal species, another forest felled. The earth shuddered, the skies darkened, even the weather was wild. In this time, there were some who knew, some who dared not look, some who were so wrapped up in their daily life they hardly even noticed. And there were those who were caught in the thick of it. They fought to protect their land, to save their sacred places, to stop their islands from drowning. For years they carried on unheeded, teaching their children the ways of nature, struggling to protect what was precious. In the very heart of the death machine, in the places that had planned and executed the conquering of the earth, in the cities of glass and steel built on the bones of slavery, plantation people, and factory workers, a band of peaceful warriors started to emerge. They had decided enough was enough. They declared a rebellion against the extinction machine. They took to the streets, they occupied the capital, shut down the offices, sang songs of love for wild ways. They did it again and again, hoping someone somewhere would listen, hoping the ones who had their hands on the controls would turn the machine around or shut it down. But it did no good, or it was too late, or maybe the machine was just out of control. Maybe no one knew how to stop it for good. Some of the rebels decided to try something else. They would carry on with the protest, carry on shouting from the rooftops, but they did something else too. In the time of the Great Pause, when the crowning virus swept the world, they realised that Mother Earth was showing how she could heal herself. When the cars and planes stopped, when the factories closed, when the ships were tied up in port, she sent animals throughout the cities. She cleaned the air and made the rivers run clear again. The rebels noticed and decided to follow her lead. They planted food forests in the heart of the machine. They joined together to build communities that looked out for each other. They sat around the fire as we're doing now, telling tales of how they would work hand in hand with the peoples from other lands who had been doing this same work for as long as anyone could remember. They made a pact to never take power over each other or any other, to walk in step with Gaia's law, to act in all ways as if the time of now was with them then. For many years, they planted forests, grew food, and shared whatever they had. They took over empty buildings to house the homeless. They converted dirty factories into places to learn and grow. And most of all, they sang. There was a song for every occasion, for the death of each species, for the joy of labour, for birth and death, each season, each cycle of the moon. Their songs sang this world we now have into being. There is one song we sing now, you'll know it. It's the one we heard them sing about this time we're in. We sing it as often as we can, so they can hear it and follow its tune to reach us here. I'd like to now hand you over to Professor Rupert Reed to take the conversation forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. That was really powerful, and thanks to Chris, who is missed here this evening. So I'm going to keep my remarks relatively short, and then Ruth will say a few words, and then there'll be quite a long time for us to all talk together. And I think that's really important. It's more important than it usually is, and in my opinion, it's always important to get very serious feedback from you all who are here this evening. So I've already put in the chat a document I wrote, which some of the people here this evening have contributed to, which summarizes some of what I'll be saying and goes into a bit more detail on some of it, a kind of introduction to transformative adaptation. So if you want to sort of review the stuff that comes up this evening or drill down into it more, then please feel free to read that afterwards. It may answer some of your questions. Feel free also to share it, but if you do share it, please share it discriminatingly, not to just anybody. Share it with people who you think may be interested in it and able to think about it and consider it. Because that may not be everybody. And the reasons why it may not be everybody, at least yet, are quite interesting, I think. And I'll sort of start with those. So if we look at the name for a minute, transformative adaptation, which we shorten to TRAD sometimes. The thing which is most striking about it, perhaps, is not the word transformative, which is a sort of wonderful, positive word which everyone can vibe with, but the word adaptation. And as has already been implied, a key part of the motivation here is the thought that it is too late for a purely mitigation-focused approach to the climate and ecological emergency. It's too late, in other words, purely to try to solve the problem or prevent some kind of disaster or worse, because disasters are already here and there will be more disasters coming, and that is certain. It's certain because of the feedbacks that have already been unleashed. It is certain because of certain time lags in the system. And it is certain because we know, it stands to reason now, it's obvious, it's clear given the path, especially of Extinction Rebellion so far, in terms of raising the alarm, but that alarm not being acted upon in any adequate way. We know that human beings and their systems at large are not going to respond in the kind of way that, in some sense, obviously, they should. One way of kind of summing this up is to say that it is virtually certain, it would take some kind of miracle for it not to be the case, that Extinction Rebellion's demands as they stand are not going to be met. and in particular that demand 2 is not going to be met, it still makes sense to say we ought to be aiming to reduce carbon emissions to 0 and to reduce biodiversity loss to 0 by 2025. But it's been 2 years now since Extinction Rebellion started. So 2 years out of the 7 that were there to get to that objective. And how much actual action has there been to achieve that objective? You know, we all know that there's been hardly any at all. All this is quite hard to come to terms with, but the clear implication of it, as I say, is that it's clear to more and more of us that it's not enough to talk about prevention and precaution and mitigation. These all remain vital, but we have to take seriously adaptation as well. We have to recognize that we are moving into a world which will be different from any world we've ever been in before. And we're going to need to adapt to that, as well as try to stop it from spiraling ever faster out of control. So what does adaptation mean? This is addressed in some detail in the document that's in the chat. Very briefly, adaptation can be divided into 3 forms. There's what we now call shallow adaptation, which is what people used to simply call adaptation, which means things like building higher seawalls. In other words, this is the kind of adaptation that tries to keep the machine, the mega machine, moving forward as it currently is, but accepts that there are consequences to that in terms of worsening climatic conditions, for example, and tries to cope with those by engaging in shallow or superficial adaptations. And it's quite clear that that's radically insufficient and indeed in some ways harmful. Then there's deep adaptation, which many of you will be aware of. And the deep adaptation project is, in my opinion, a very worthwhile one. Deep adaptation says we need to prepare for the possibility, likelihood, some, including Jem Bendell, the originator of the concept, argue certainty that societal collapse is going to occur, and we need to seek to make that less bad than it would otherwise be by preparing on a macro scale, on a micro scale, by preparing psychologically, preparing in every way. It's a whole agenda. And my view is that the deep adaptation agenda is absolutely necessary at this point, because we totally cannot rule out that, that something truly worth calling collapse is coming, or is in some ways already upon us. I disagree with my colleague Jem when he argues that collapse is inevitable and near term. I think that that's a particular reading of the situation, which risks going beyond the facts and also risks being demotivating potentially. And some of you may have seen that there's been a lot of talk in the blogosphere and in social media just in the last few days about this question. And there's been more tough questioning raised about deep adaptation. But as I've just tried to imply, my view is that questioning is to some extent misconceived, because even if the questioners are right, that Jem's own reading of the science is excessively negative and doomerist, they're wrong in thinking that means we don't have to do deep adaptation, because deep adaptation is like an insurance policy. It's just common sense if you think that there is now at least a real risk of collapse. Transformative adaptation is a potential ally to deep adaptation, but it lies, if you will, in the space in between shallow adaptation and deep adaptation. Transformative adaptation says, maybe there's room for a sort of win-win here, or as I like to put it, actually a win-win-win. That on the one hand, we can mitigate, and we must continue to mitigate. We mustn't lose sight of the absolute urgency and necessity of doing everything we can to stop excessive carbon emissions being released, to stop biodiversity loss, etc. On another hand, it's absolutely vital to work with nature rather than against nature. So if you're thinking how to exemplify transformative adaptation, a good image, I believe, is rather than thinking of higher seawalls, you think of things like restoring mangrove swamps or restoring wetlands as ways of coping with the sea level rise that is baked in already, tragically, to our situation. And on the third hand, transformative adaptation says, let's try to transform society, whether or not it collapses, trying to prevent its collapse without being fixated on trying to keep this society, the failed society we have, staggering forward. Let's try to transform that society in the kind of way that we know it needs to be transformed in anyway. So as was hinted in Christina's opening remarks, that means things like drastically relocalizing, probably living lower on the food chain, certainly living closer to the making of our own food. So transformative adaptation, as I say, think of it as lying between shallow adaptation and deep adaptation, and as being an agenda which I believe, and the people in the TRAD group believe, thoroughly rises to the kind of challenge which our time presents us with. It rises to that challenge entirely honestly. Unlike deep adaptation, it doesn't assume what the outcome is going to be, but is a bit more open-minded about the possible outcomes and a bit more humble about how much we know about what is going to happen. Our ordinary society takes for granted that society, roughly as it is going to continue. Deep adaptation takes for granted that society is going to come to a shuddering halt. Transformative adaptation doesn't take either of those things for granted, but tries to stay with the trouble and work with the uncertainty and create the best thing that we can out of the horrendous mess in which we find ourselves. Now, some of you may be asking, how is this different from stuff that people have been doing for years? So how is this different from the transition towns movement? How is it different from permaculture, for example? And the short answer is, well, it isn't really different. So why bother talking about it at all? Well, that has an interesting answer. One part of the answer to that question is that it seems worthwhile to have this kind of big picture as an alternative to the kind of mitigation fixation which has characterized Extinction Rebellion so far. You know, adaptation isn't even in the demands as they're worded at the moment. And as an alternative to the full-on deep adaptation agenda. There's another more sort of substantive reason for thinking that it's worth talking about transformative adaptation, which was again hinted at in Christina's opening remarks. And it's this. We think that Extinction Rebellion and the inheritance, if you will, of what Extinction Rebellion has already achieved may have something to offer and to add to what's already going on in permaculture, among smallholders, in the transition towns movement, etc. And what that is, well, perhaps unsurprisingly, it centers around practices of nonviolent direct action and the like. There's something that's kind of missing from the transition towns perspective and the permaculture perspective, and that is, very roughly speaking, and with a very small p, a political perspective, a macro perspective on change and how it's achieved, and a micro perspective on how the kinds of things that you want to do, maybe on a local level, can be enabled to happen. Because something, for example, that people in the transition towns movement have experienced again and again over the last decade or more is that initiatives that they've wanted to bring in have been stymied by planning rules or by local councils and so on and so forth. And something that we strongly believe is that just as it's not good enough to trust in our conventional political system to solve our problems anymore, and as it's arguably not good enough to bet everything on Extinction Rebellion being able to alter that political system so fundamentally and swiftly and so on, that all the things that we want to do and that we need to do get allowed quite quickly. Rather, we need to take some of these things into our own hands. And that fits very much with the transformative adaptation perspective. So, for example, you might imagine citizens' assemblies being created by ourselves. And how do you get to that point? And how do you get to a point where those citizens' assemblies get taken any notice of? Well, maybe by means of nonviolent direct action. Or to put things in an even more concrete and direct way, if you're wanting to grow some food on some land, or take back control over some local supply chains, etc., but there are businesses or local councillors or planning rules or whatever that are getting in the way, maybe what you need to add to the upswell of local people who want to do this thing, and people maybe in the local transition movement and so on and so forth, is the kind of creativity and willingness to break the law and willingness to think a little bit more boldly and act accordingly that we find in Extinction Rebellion. So integral to the idea of transformative adaptation is, what if we were to take the kind of tools that Extinction Rebellion has used so brilliantly and apply them where necessary to try to enable some of the kinds of changes that we so desperately want and need to occur locally, whether that might be defending land which is threatened by development, or reclaiming some land for landless people, or one idea which some of us think is quite attractive, is what if we were to expand the protests against HS2 by seeking to reclaim some land which they want to use for that route, and be really serious about defending that land for the production of food or for the creation of an eco-village. Now, some of these ideas are quite full on, and some of them might not appeal to everybody. Again, as Christina hinted, another part of the appeal of transformative adaptation is that it's obviously kind of built into it that it's not, as it were, all about being arrestable. That isn't the apogee of this. That's simply a kind of means to an end. And the end is whatever it takes to engage in this kind of broader project of seeking to create the kind of adaptations and flourishings and so on that we actually want and need. And insofar as those can be done by people simply, say, banding together and growing some food together, then absolutely great. So there could be room here, there could be scope here for a large flank of sort of XR light, if you will, where there is no particular calling upon people to think that being arrested and going to prison, whatever, is what it's all about. Rather, what it's all about is doing the transformative adaptation, and where necessary, engaging in NVDA or whatever else is necessary within, the principles and values that we have to enable those kind of things to happen. That's really mostly what I wanted to say to introduce this discussion here this evening. I hope it's made some sense to you. Our thought is that this vision is a vision which could be attractive to a lot of people who are in XR and a lot of people who are outside XR. That it's a vision which could enable a kind of broader alliance than XR has managed to bring together to date to occur, most obviously with groups like the transition movement and others of a similar ilk. That you could think of it within the sort of scope of the kind of movement of movements concept, which we've been taught to favor over the last year, rightly so in my opinion, but which hasn't really come to fruition nearly as much as it could have done. And that in this way, this could be a kind of framework which could be quite helpful for thinking about how to move on in and from the difficult situation in which we find ourselves now. And by that, I mean both the situation of despair with regard to the lack of actual real world change that we've encountered, the situation of difficulty in knowing where to go from here in Extinction Rebellion, and the situation that many of us have in our own lives of finding these questions quite difficult and pressing. So this is not by way of saying don't go on the rebellion in September. This is not by way of saying this is the only thing that anybody should be doing now. But it is by way of saying here is perhaps a new way of seeing some of the things we've already been doing, both inside XR and outside XR, which could make sense, and a way in which we might be able to provide some cement to bring people together from a wide variety of outlooks into a path which could make sense in the very difficult times that we're moving into. By that, I mean difficult for XR, difficult certainly economically, and difficult obviously in terms of ongoing and worsening environmental degradation. So I think that's really enough from me. As I say, I want to hear your questions and get your feedback. Is this making sense? Do you need further examples or whatever? Yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Rupert. Yeah, thank you. That was great. We're going to go to Ruth, who is going to have a few minutes. Is it 10 minutes you said to?
Yes,
about that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share a screen now. Hold on, if I can. Not on IT. Here we go. This is just a quick intro. I'm just using some slides on the idea of climate emergency centres. They're slides that were developed that people can then use if they're setting up groups to set up a climate emergency centre in their local area. They can kind of adapt them for theirs. So you can use them for going to councils or going to other groups or property building owners and things like that. So I live in Farnham, and we've got a team together, which is, we've got our meeting on Monday, I think, with a bunch of other groups in the area. So I've got these slides together for Farnham. These ones are built for that. Okay, so the idea of climate emergency centres, they're not an XR thing, but there are a lot of people who created this or are involved in XR, and it fits very well in with transformative adaptation and some of the ideas that Rupert was talking about. So we know the situation. Rupert's just covered it very nicely about where we're at, and that nobody is actually meeting even the Paris goals. In my local borough, we've found, so a lot of councils have declared a climate emergency. But they're not doing very much about it, as Rupert was just saying. And so what we found is that when you look at the emissions in boroughs and who is responsible for what, like in my local borough, which is called Waverley Borough Council, they only actually have direct control over 1 to 3% of emissions. And the Surrey County Council, which has also declared a climate emergency, has 30% of emissions it has direct control over. So over 50% of the emissions in the local area need massive amounts of buy-in from local residents and businesses in order to get anything like what we need to happening locally. So the idea is that we are going to help local communities come together and start building what they need. Because councils are clearly not able to do it. They've got massive budget cuts, they've got austerity going in, now COVID, they've really kind of run out of money. Okay. Sorry, how do you generate this community buy-in? So the idea of a climate emergency centre is the next logical step. So after declaring a climate emergency, what do you need to do next? what the building is meant to do, or the centre itself. It doesn't need to be a building, it could be land. It offers a focal point for organisations, residents and businesses to work together and build a community climate action plan. So you can start looking at energy, transport, waste management, education, planning, land use. What do we need to look at? What does our community look like? How set up is it to live in harmony with the planet and what we need? And what do we need to change? So it's designed to engage the wider community. It's not, although it's a climate emergency centre, it's actually looking at what are the local community's needs. So it's not just about cutting emissions, it's about how do we do it in a way that meets the community's needs. Because a lot of the things we need in terms of social justice and local area needs are actually fixed by looking at things from a sustainable perspective. So looking at food poverty and fuel poverty and homelessness, the Climate Emergency Centre can start to engage with some of those issues too. So within the centre that you can have, it's a space that the community fills with what it needs. So you could have talks and seminars, you could have workshop space, you could have circular economy resources, things around adaptation and resilience, engagement, so community energy schemes, people's assemblies. Part of this is linking in with the, I don't know if people know about the Future Democracy Trust the People initiative, but one of the ideas around the Climate Emergency Centres is to have monthly people's assemblies where the whole community are invited to come, and they can feed into the Climate Emergency Centre about some of the things that community needs. And what kinds of things need to be happening in the Climate Emergency Centre, but also back out to council about what they want the council to do. So it sort of forms a link. There's also, you can have things like time banks, veggie or vegan cafe, repair cafes, bike repairs, events, put on events as well, things where people come together and enjoy being in a space together. In a socially distanced way currently. So solutions like no waste shop, permaculture, market space, rooftop gardens, things like that. Many, many things. Here's a couple of examples. So the Hive in Dalston was happening a few years ago. That ended in 2019. That was the first sort of one that used the business model that we're saying. There's a way to create a climate emergency centre that can be a self-funding centre. Which I'll explain in a minute. And during its 2.5 years in existence in Dalston in London, it had over 1,000 community events and had just so many different groups coming together and sort of cross-fertilizing as well. So once you start getting different generations, different cultures, different skills coming in and sort of sharing with those things with each other, you get new things created. So yeah, so that one was the first sort of successful use of that model. The Climate Emergency Centre is a really new idea, so we've just started doing it. There's one Climate Emergency Centre that's up and running. There's a whole load of teams getting together at the moment to build them in their local areas. There's a group in Staines who's just been offered a building in the town centre there, so they might be up and running quite soon. But the one in Ilford is absolutely massive. It's an old home base, like a huge warehouse thing. There's a big gardening section on the side, and there's a guy called Mike who's doing a lot of research at London University on vertical gardening. Oh right, I have to hurry. Yeah, so he's going to be doing stuff in the gardening space there. Okay, financials. CEC, 100% discretionary business rates. All business owners, this is going to take a bit of time, sorry. All business owners have to pay business rates, well, property owners on non-residential buildings, and they can be like £100,000 to £200,000 a year. If they let you, they lease that space to a charity or a not-for-profit organisation, you can get up to 100% of those business rates off for the property owner. So they're saving a load of money. The idea is to say, hey, look, we can save you this money if you let us use our building, but give us a little bit of it back, and we can use that to fund what we're doing, and you're helping the local community. So you're being a nice business owner and helping the local community. I'm trying to whiz through things now. So say a building owner pays £150,000 per year in business rates on a vacant property. A climate emergency centre obtains like an 80% discount, let's say, on business rates, which are passed on to the building owner. The owner then pays the outstanding 20%, which would be £30,000, but contributes, say, 20% of its savings to the Climate Emergency Centre. You've then got £24,000 in funding, while the building owner has saved £96,000. And you've got £24,000 that you can use to fund whatever it is that you want to do in your community centre. The benefits for the building owner are you're protecting against theft, it's giving back to your community, you're saving tens of thousands of pounds, you've got 24-hour caretaker people there, people on site looking after the building, and you're protecting the building and making sure it's not vandalised. Benefits for the teams involved, it generates income streams to fund projects and build resources. So you can hire space, have a cafe there, have merchandise, whatever. It's also about sharing resources, skills and knowledge with other like-minded organisations and supporting each other's growth. It improves access to the community through an established informal gathering space, so it can become a hub where people come together. And then you can start talking to the community and seeing what's going on, so you get to know each other and what each other's needs are. And it's about building community resilience, meeting local community needs, developing strong mitigation, adaptation, and supporting networks for future crises. So who can use it? Anybody. So in Farnham, we've got things like an eco cinema, a repair cafe, a community farm, Youth Strike for Climate vet here. We've got Black Lives Matter here. We've got the university. We've got a food bank. We've got allotment groups. We've got a bit of a housing crisis here. So there's a Homes for Farnham just built up, just getting going as well. And there's youth groups as well near here. So all of those, they're called the Vines. So all of these places can come together and use the space, and all be under one roof. And I'm going to stop sharing. And that was the fast. I didn't realise it took so long to get through those. Sorry, April. That was the fastest I've whizzed through those ever. So yeah, so that's the idea of climate emergency centres. There's one up and running, hopefully a second one soon, and a bunch of teams. There's a handbook which gives you little step-by-step instructions, which is sort of there, but draft form. So if anybody wants a copy of it, let me know. Yeah, and a little chat where everyone gets together and meets every Thursday to catch up.
Thank you, Ruth. Sorry, yeah, I think I might have been a minute or two early, but thank you. I just I also wanted to leave space really so that we can hear from you and what sort of clarities you might need to understand better, what sort of, you know, what arises in you as you hear this. You know, what are the differences that you hear and what are not? And I think also this is about a reach for recognizing the poverty of our own thinking on this. It's only informed at this moment by a very few people and coming from the kind of the XR background. And actually, you know, we know that there are people who've been working in this kind of field much, much longer, rooted in their communities already, you know, much more rooted in local community needs. And so we're reaching for, you know, your heads to say, what have you thought of this? To come up with ideas for these kind of transformative adaptations that could be supported by nonviolent direct action behind it, making it happen, making it possible to do it, not necessarily waiting for the permission for it to happen. Thank you. So I would just like to offer the space to anyone who has any questions, anything they'd like clarified, anyone specific that you'd like to ask a question on. Oh, and that is missing. I don't see any in the chat. Have I missed anything? No. Okay. Thank you. Yes, Richard. You're muted at the moment, Richard. It might be that because you've switched him off. Una,
so I'm there now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah. That's it. Thanks, Richard.
Okay. I was just going to ask, well, two things really. One is that can we not have to put questions in the chat, because I'm a hopeless typist and I wouldn't finish the question before we'd all gone back to bed. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question vocally.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. I'm Richard. I'm from Hay. I'm from a coordinator with XR Hay. I coordinate mainly with XR marches, though a little bit with XR Cymru as well. Locally, we have a little group of us at the moment who are concerned about the health of the River Wye. Some of you might have seen press coverage of extra bloom in the River Wye, increasingly up to the upper reaches, due to phosphate levels, partly due to sewerage, smaller sewerage units, and also intensive poultry units. We're doing research, working with local groups, Committee for the Protection of Rural Wales, the Wye and Usk Foundation, Fish Legal, etc. I see this as transformative adaptation. We want to transform the Wye into a healthy river. In the end, who controls most of these areas of, say, the intensive poultry units? Multinational corporations like Cargill's, who process 1.6 million chickens every week in Hereford. In the end, we're going to be up against them. There's only one thing they understand: us getting out and shouting and screaming in the street. I don't think we can, I'm sure nobody is really saying this, but we can't say we're going to put all our efforts into transformative adaptation. We also have to be not forgetting the DNA of XR and what the successes we really have had, the huge successes. If you talk to all kinds of businesses at the moment, it's in the ether to talk about the climate emergency, and we've done that through XR. But in the end, we are going to be up against Cargill, and there's no other way to do it but to shout and scream and get heavy with them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Though I'm unclear, was there a question in there for you?
No, I think it's more of a statement, and what do folks think about that?
Okay, thank you. Rupert would like to respond.
Yeah, I'll make a start on that. I think that's a really useful contribution. I'm very sympathetic. I hope it was reasonably clear in what I said, but if it wasn't, let me reiterate it. That part of the point of the idea of transformative adaptation and of thinking of this as something which XR or people in XR or people broadly sympathetic with XR might want to think of themselves as getting involved in is exactly the reason you give, Richard. Namely that it's an illusion to think that purely local action in some narrow sense, or people just trying to do the right thing in their own backyards, it's an illusion to think that those things can ever be enough by themselves. And sometimes that illusion, in my experience, is an illusion which attracts people in the transition movement or permaculturists or people in the organic world, etc. It's totally understandable to be attracted by that illusion, because when one actually starts to contemplate the vastness of what needs to be done and the vastness of the enemies, if you will, that we're up against, it's overwhelming. But as you say, we're never going to get what we really need without doing some of that confronting. So 2 points. Firstly, to succeed in doing a lot of the transformative adaptation work that we want to do, we are going to have to do stuff like nonviolent direct action, and that is built into the paradigm, and that's what makes this idea distinctive. Secondly, I think we should be willing to face the fact that it looks, let's put it this way, unlikely that we're going to fully succeed. it looks unlikely that we're going to achieve the kind of victory that we crave, or that rationally we should have if human beings were rational beings, right? You know, how likely is it? Can you see a route by means of which we get to fully put Cargill back in the box within the next few years? You know, I'm not saying don't try. I'm saying we need to have insurance on that front. And that's where deep adaptation might come in. But it's also, again, where transformative adaptation comes in, quite simply in the sense that we don't assume that we're going to be able to achieve the kind of total victory that XR has traditionally spoken of when it put forward its demands. So on the one hand, we accept that we're not going to often get anywhere at all without being willing to break the rules, break the law, engage in NVDA, etc. But we also accept that there's going to be an ongoing need for adaptation to likely worsening conditions, because the idea that we're going to achieve a complete victory is, to say the least, an idea which you wouldn't want to bet the farm on. I hope that serves as a useful answer to your comment, and an indication of how I think we're not that far apart in the way we're thinking here.
Thank you, Rupert. There's a question from Andy Lyon, and then Nick, and then Ruth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, on sort of a different topic, really. It seems like with transport infrastructure, there really needs to be a kind of national change in the way it's thought about. You know, we need a completely transformative approach to being able to cycle places and walk places, and there were some amazing things that happened during, you know, the lockdown, where, you know, loads of people were just out on the road cycling, you know, with young children, and you know, and the cars that came up were being really courteous to them, and it seemed like, you know, that can happen, but now, you know, the dangers are so great on being on the roads. It's kind of gone back to the way it was, and it does seem like it needs, you know, the national government to massively change that in order for that change to happen. It's difficult to see how we can do, you know, the critical mass bike rides make a difference, but they, you know, you're putting people at risk continuously in order to make that change seems difficult. I just wondered how we kind of you know, tackle that in a trad sort of way.
Thank you. Rupert, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to take that. Yeah. So, well, I think that question is quite closely related to the previous one, really. And so my response is going to be broadly similar. You know, again, you know, I agree with you. Transport policy was my main policy expertise for quite a long time, and the case there for national paradigm shift is enormously strong. I mean, just keep pursuing that, and there are some openings now in terms of possibilities, for example, to get a better deal for cyclists in the coronavirus era. So yeah, look, again, we're not saying here don't carry on trying to pursue national transformative change. We should do that. Just don't put all your eggs in the basket of thinking that you're likely to fully succeed. Also, be sure that the kind of changes you're making, if you will, build in an adaptation perspective. So an example of that would be, we need to think about this, and no one's even barely begun to think about this yet. We need to think about the difficulties that there are going to be in years ahead for transport, consequent upon global overheat. right? We need to think about, for example, difficulties that are likely to increase in frequency on train lines and roads because of all sorts of things, including simply higher temperatures, sometimes melting or damaging surfaces. We need to think about things like, we need to massively improve facilities for cyclists. But what do you do when you're in such a extreme heat wave that cycling any long distance is no longer safe? Right? These are conversations and difficulties which people have barely begun to wrestle with. So those would be the kind of things that if this agenda were to really sort of get going, and to be in the public debate more, and to be in think tanks and stuff like that, these are the kinds of questions we would then be asking. And one point of trying to go down this route of getting serious, both at the level of discourse and at the level of action on transformative adaptation, is to get those conversations and difficult thoughts started. And
I'd like to add in on that. Actually, that part of those difficult conversations also begin at the local level. For instance, if you were looking at reclaiming your town centre for, a week of no traffic allowed, in a climate emergency centre where it to be available, you could be inviting, all the local business people to be involved in the conversation that says, what do we do when we can't get our supplies in? How do we, network in order to make it possible to shut down our town centre and have no traffic coming in, or to have it only before certain hours of the day? So you're kind of generating a space where these sort of difficult conversations begin on a local level that say, yeah, we might be just doing this for our town, but what we need, we can show this can happen in a town. Now it needs to happen nationally. But we have to have these conversations and recognize that this is what is going to happen. We can't just keep carrying on with the roads going the way they are, thinking it's just going to carry on indefinitely. It definitely isn't. So let's start the conversations locally, and then we show that we can make it happen. And then we shut down the roads, we block the roads and make it happen, but with the businesses on board with us, showing that with enough willing, everybody can make it happen. Okay, so there was, Ruth, did you want to answer that particular question as well? Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of fits in with some of the, I was just going to, so climate emergency centres came from so Phoenix, who has been involved in environmental activism since the early 90s. And has been part of the road protests then, and has been involved in all sorts of things from there, Reclaim the Streets, Occupy, anti-globalization, all those sorts of things. And what he's generally done in the past is slightly illegal, as set up squats. So the squat would become this space where people who were active, so people who were going out to road protests, people who were trying to stop the development of something and the raising of people's homes and to create office blocks or whatever it might be, or all these different things, and kind of fracking and things like that were going on. Those squats would be their places that they could come back to. They could organize, they could come back together, they could network with other people and other groups and what other groups were doing, and then go back out again. So it became a space for people who were doing the active work to go out and do those things. And Rising Up went to the Hive before XR started, a part of their organizational things. So those spaces become those places where that creative action starts to happen, where people start to come together, start to mingle, start to share stories, start to share ideas and energy. And that's where you get the new stuff coming out of. So when you get things happening in the local community, it becomes more, as things start to share and start to spread. I guess that's what I'm trying to.
Thank you, Ruth. Nick.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Is my microphone working all right?
Yep, that's great.
Yep. Hi, so hi everybody. Well, when I stuck my finger up, I had about 2 things I wanted to say, and now I've probably got about 10, so let's try and do this. First of all, back in 2006, I was working in Herefordshire Council in the sustainability unit, and I remember going to a conference of other sustainability officers somewhere like Liverpool. And we were all asked to think about what the implications of climate change might be for our local authority. And it took us about 10 minutes to come up with a very, very long list of all the things, including some of the things Rupert was mentioning about roads becoming, you know, not passable, for example, or old people being stuck and unable to get to healthcare and so on and so forth. So it is, that's 14 years ago. And so little has happened either in local authorities or elsewhere to start on this journey of adaptation. In fact, actually, I wrote a kind of guerrilla policy for Herefordshire Council, which covered both mitigation and adaptation back in 2007, which promptly was buried under a big pile of other things. So I warmly welcome everything that Rupert has said. I went on to spend a lot of time with transition towns, so I can see readily the DNA of transition towns. In fact, in 2010, we brought Rob Hopkins, and I think Hereford was the 70th transition town, and we had a great unleashing in 2010. So, as you correctly say, a lot of work has been done by myself and other people in this locality and around the country. And sort of fast forwarding, in fact, I was in touch. I want to welcome what Ruth brought to the table, because back in February, I was in touch with Phoenix. We actually, the only reason we didn't go ahead and sign a lease on what we were calling a climate action hub space in Hereford in March was because the guy who had to sign the lease came down with coronavirus on the day that we were due to meet with him, which in a sense was fortuitous, because otherwise we'd have a lease around our neck, which we might not be able to use. But that whole development is ready to rock and roll as soon as it looks like the conditions have become feasible. So it's all very well talking about bringing people together in spaces, but at the moment, somebody's going to have to explain to me how realistic that is to embark on, you know, commitments to do with climate action hub spaces in the present circumstances. I'd love somebody to tell me that we could confidently do that. I want to just engage with two things that have been said, and there's a question coming. The question actually relates to the climate action hub space or the climate emergency centres thing, because of course, bringing people together from all sorts of different movements and backgrounds is a great project. And that's exactly what we were trying to do, to create common cause across a wide variety of organisations, including the Ornithological Club and the CPRE, and there are a wide variety of organisations in Herefordshire. But of course, there is also a problem in that, which is that to cohere something like that so that people don't just start arguing with each other and, well, you shouldn't have done this, and we want to do this, and you're stopping us from doing this. So if one wing of that is committed to NVDA, and I do support that absolutely, and what Richard was saying about the why, which is also something I've been engaged with, I completely support the idea that at some point it might be a very wise thing to do to actually stop the delivery of soya from Brazil to intensive poultry sheds in Herefordshire, but only, and this is really important, if we have done the winning of hearts and minds first of all. So that instead of being seen as a bunch of nutters, most importantly by the farming community, who are very alert and alive to issues like the why, for example, and know that it's complicated. And if they see a bunch of people jumping up and down and getting heavy, to use your word, Richard, who haven't done their homework and haven't prepared the soil, pun intended, before we take that kind of action, then actually we could be taking a big step backwards. So my question, Rupert, is when you talk about movement of movements, how does that idea intersect with some of the things I've just been rattling on about, please?
Yeah, super stuff. I think what your points are very well taken. Look, partly what's being envisaged here clearly is something new. And some of this stuff is going to have to get worked out as it goes along if we're going to make it happen. You know, one of the things that I want to do soon is I'm already encouraged by the response and feedback we're getting here this evening, is take some of this to Rob Hopkins and other colleagues in the transition movement and ask them, you know, what do you think? Rob, of course, is an XR sympathizer. His partner is very involved in XR and so on. I think there's real hope here that there's room for a meeting of minds. And let's remind ourselves that the background here is a situation which is to some extent radically new and very desperate. And it seems to me that what is called for is for those people who are already, and for many more who want to, get involved in making those kind of real changes on the ground, to find some way of, as you say, creating common cause with those who have more of a background in politics, in change making on a more macro scale, in protest, in the kind of arts of protest and rebellious creativity that have been so powerful in Extinction Rebellion and so on. And this, it seems to me, is what is called for now as an emergency response, which is realistic about the nature of the threat and realistic about the increasing incredibility, tragically, of traditional methods of achieving our objectives, including the methods of Extinction Rebellion itself so far. We achieved amazing stuff last year, as Richard said, in terms of changing the climate, pun sort of unintended, changing the climate in this country in terms of public opinion. I do political liaison for Extinction Rebellion. We're constantly meeting politicians and business people who are like, well, they say to us things like, keep doing what you're doing, because you're pushing the envelope and you're broadening the Overton window and so on, and it makes life difficult for us, but that's what we need and so on. So great. But how much has actually changed on the ground? We all know that we are still a million miles away from the actual kind of policy changes, etc., that we need. So it seems to me that if you will, we have to adapt to that reality, and that is what this new constellation would seek to do and to midwife. Yeah, that's what I've got so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Rupert. I have Chris waiting, and then Vicky after Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I was immediately drawn in and on side this evening as soon as you started to talk about, the rebels who are falling away and the rebels who are losing heart, because I'm aware of so many of those, and I really do fear for the next rebellion, because I really don't know how many of them are going to keep going and will be there. I absolutely, as far as I can, without reading it deeply, understand what you've said, and I'm completely with it. I'm then coming down to the sort of practical things that have been talked about that went on from transformative adaptation with the examples of the climate emergency. And what I've seen or become more aware of in the last couple of years is the absolute growth in the small area I live in. It's a small town, we're near Telford, we're in Shropshire, but near Telford. Massive numbers of things like people starting, the food banks and the food shares and the bike shops and the repair cafes, and I see that all going on. Where my heart then slightly sinks is because, having had some contact with some of these, which are doing superb jobs, and maybe this is the way it's got to be, they're all doing their own thing. People become very protective of the little bit they've got and very unwilling then to sort of be joining these things together in a broader sense. And that, I think, is where my heart slightly then began to sink. Not because that anything that's going wrong, anything that they're doing is wrong, but because of how we need to make it bigger and more community focused. And that's where I'm not sure how that's going to happen, except in my head, until we start getting in this country even bigger climate crises that actually force people, by which time it then is very difficult to start working in these different ways. So, I mean, that's my question, I guess, is, you know, how do we go about supporting what's already there and getting it to be more joined up?
Thank you, Rupert. I'd like to answer that one, as you've been on, you know, and if, but Ruth might also have a take on this. And for me, that's about, you know, when you have the joy of seeing these sort of places independently springing up, the question isn't, oh, we're going to come in and do that as well. It's to go to these people where this is already happening, to bring them together in a well-facilitated space where everyone gets space to have their voice heard, to bring their emotions into the room as we do in XR, you know, to really feel connected, and then say, what is it you need to make this work in the community even better than you're doing right now? If it wasn't about just financially being able to pay your rent, what if it was also about how do we make this more accessible to the community to want to use these services more? Because it's needed, not necessarily because it's about trying to pay the rents and things. Does that kind of see how, you know, it switches the focus to ask them how they see it rolling out in the community even better, because they're already there and they're already rooted trying to make it work. So not to come in and say, oh, we can make this work better, but asking people for their initiative in how to make it better. Yeah, Ruth, do you have a point on that as well?
Yeah, just exactly what you were saying. I mean, in where I am in Farnham, a couple of people, one of them's involved in the Farnham Community Farm, and one of them's involved with the Sustainability Festival that happens here every year as well. And everyone's saying, like, we're all in our little bits, but we're weaker because we're separate and we need to come together. So that's where the team is kind of building, and we're reaching out to now the other groups that are happening, and that's our next step. Because exactly as you were saying.
Thank you.
It's about that I'm doing it in my local town. This is where I live. I'm part of the community. I'm talking to other members of the community, and we're coming together because we have shared concerns. And
I think also having it well facilitated with a space for the grief and the coming to the presence of the truth of why we're doing it is really important, because it doesn't become about the business model. It becomes about the people model, the care in our communities. Chris, did you have a question? No, Vicky, sorry. Vicky, you were waiting.
Hi, yes, thank you. It speaks to me, absolutely. It feels to me there's been a hole in me, actually, after, you know, knowing that XR needs to change, being there absolutely in the beginning, but knowing that things don't stay the same. And if you're still doing the same thing and thinking in the same way as you were 2 years ago, then you've probably got something wrong. And, you know, I can't see, there is that thing about, you know, that old saying about living the change that you want to see. And this speaks more to me of that unless people transform, as well as the system you're wanting to transform, then you've got a conflict, or it's not going to happen. It also, for me, I'm very involved in regen, and it, you know, it feels like this brings regenerative culture so much into it, and I've always felt that needs to be underneath it, but there seems to have been a separation. How to get that, the action and that together. And I suppose the question is, I live in a small rural village. Well, I don't even live in the village, but I've managed to get a group together here. We are calling ourselves Life. And I've managed to get myself co-opted onto the parish council in order, I suppose, to do some of the things. And we meet as this group. We've divided up into transport, energy, biodiversity. So we've, you know, I mean, I'm delighted. It feels like a very small thing to be doing. We've been doing it during lockdown. It's been my contribution in what's felt like a very small way. And I suppose it's asking, how can we in a small rural environment make this bigger? We don't have a venue. Yeah. Yes, I suppose that's my question. Is this the right foundation? Is this something, are we starting in the right way? Could it grow? Is this the right thing to be doing?
Thank you, Vicky. Rupert, you would like to answer that?
Yeah, I'd love to have a go. Once again, what a great question. Let me get to your explicit question, but on the way there, two things. Firstly, I think you're so right about the point about regen, right? This has been the ideology of Extinction Rebellion, and it's such a great ideology, but it's so often been honored in the breach rather than in the observance, as the saying goes, right? We need to somehow put regen at the foundation and at the center of everything. And I think that a trad type approach makes that much more likely. How does it make it more likely? That brings me to the second thing, partly because what this is really about, as I see it, and I think as a lot of us see it, is it's about a kind of determination to embody the change, right? It's saying, we are not going to accept whatever obstacles there are to being the change we want to see in the world. So we're gonna keep on pursuing our values in whatever we do, and we're gonna keep on pursuing the projects as if we continue to be convinced that they're worthwhile, no matter what the obstacles. And that's how something like growing food on the land and nonviolent direct action, where necessary, come together. Yeah, it's saying we want to try to live the right kind of life. And if the rules or the laws or the practices or whatever are there in ways such that we can't do that, well, then we're not going to accept that. We're going to keep finding ways in which we can live that kind of life. And in that sense, it's saying that there's a certain sense in which, absolutely wonderful and essential and so on, though they are, traditional, whatever, small holding, agroforestry and so on and so forth, is not enough if it stops short of being able to be scaled up or of having unpolluted resources to draw upon. Etc. Yeah, so that's it seems to me is absolutely at the heart of the transformative adaptation approach: determination to embody the change. So then, to come to your question, Vicky, it seems to me that if you were to manage to do those first two things, then you wouldn't have to worry about, well, look, we're only a small rural community, sort of what do we matter or something. You'd be doing something absolutely phenomenal, and the kind of thing that just needs to happen all over the place. But these things could also be coordinated. One kind of dream that I have is, what if in the future, rather than thinking about having rebellions be basically in capital cities and so on, what about if you had, for example, a day of action or a week of action or a month of action, whatever you could manage, where it was people all over the country simultaneously in a joined up way, seeking to make visible our vulnerability to long supply chains, and to make visible the alternative of, might be pop-up allotments that you then defend, or whatever it is that works for you, or that you need to do in your local community to preserve and enhance life there. So that would be the kind of idea that I would have as to how this might be scaled up. So you're there in your rural community, you're thinking, yes, but we're only small. But if everybody else in their rural community and their non-rural rural community is at some point kind of trying to do the same kind of thing in the same kind of way, maybe at the same kind of time, that could be absolutely massive. And then suddenly you have something which is a demonstration of something different, and which gets into like every local newspaper and every local radio station and the national press as well, and perhaps it's international. We can dare to dream that. And then we found a way of kind of really taking this from places that think of themselves as kind of out of the loop and provincial, and making it into worldwide news. That seems to me really kind of exciting.
Thank you, Rupert. Kim had a perspective to give next, and then Una's waiting, and next is Alex's iPad. Is that
Right? It's Rachel.
Thank you. So yes, Kim, you're still muted. Nope, still muted. Okay. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist living in the same little town in Shropshire as Chris, who spoke earlier. And I've been doing some training on trauma recently with a woman called Carolyn Spring, who does a lot of trauma training. And it just struck me that what we've been learning fits in very well with what was being said earlier about people kind of falling by the wayside. I wondered if it would be okay for me to share my screen. I'd like to just show you a diagram about kind of what happens in the brain, and what I feel like this approach really underscores the trad kind of idea. Is that, can I do that?
I don't think you can, because we'd have to transfer. Oh, no.
You can allow screen sharing.
Yeah, I've just allowed it. So
allow that.
Is that working?
Yeah, okay, great.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Can you see it now?
No.
No.
Oh.
No, maybe not.
Okay, I'll just have
we
to
don't have a teenager in the room can tell us how to do it.
I'll have to show you. I'll have to try and tell you then. I'll have to try and tell you. Oh, hang on a minute. Select a window. Hang on. Yeah, maybe that's me. How's that?
Yes, that's it. It's worked.
So basically, what happens, and I feel like what is happening to a lot of rebels who are falling by the wayside, is that they get stuck in. So you know the whole adrenaline business and fight and flight. After that comes freeze. And that is the kind of back part of your brain, the survival part of your brain. And you can see in the central part of there, the kind of feelings that we get when we're stuck in that back part of our brain. I feel stuck, I feel helpless, I feel disempowered, I feel hopeless. That's our kind of lizard brain taking over. And it's really easy for us to feel like this in, when in response to everything that we hear about what could happen in the future. What I'm thinking as I listen to the kind of trad approach is that it does help us perhaps to live more from the front part of our brain, which you can see over on the left-hand side there, which says I can identify the problem, I gain knowledge, I develop skills, I can be curious, I stay calm, I'm reflective, and it helps us to imagine what we want for the future and to do all the things like Vicky was talking about just now. And what also Rupert said, keep on pursuing projects no matter what the obstacles. It just helps us to stay in an active place. So I just feel like listening to what has been said, that this can be a kind of psychological underpinning perhaps to the trad approach, in that it helps us to stay in the front part of our brain, which is the creative, which is our human brain, our problem-solving creative brain, rather than our scared animal brain, which is saying, ooh, if I just stay still and don't do anything, then I'm going to stay safe. Hope that
Thank
helps.
you, Kim. Yeah, thank you. I think I recognize this from one of the regen courses at the moment.
Okay, yes, I should say that this is Carolyn Spring copyright,
Right.
and it's being, I'm aware it's being recorded, so I'll email her tomorrow and hopefully
Lovely.
it's fine.
Could you take the screen share off so I can see places?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. That, yeah, I think that's very relevant, and I can see why you linked that. So Una was waiting, and then there was somebody else. Oh, I can't see it. But also,
it was Richard, I think. Oh, Rachel, and then
no,
Richard.
Rachel. Yes, it was Rachel. And just to mention to people that people have to leave at 8:30. So there might be some of us can stay and answer a few questions a bit longer, but I know that some people definitely have to leave at past. So Una.
So I had a whole bunch of things. Ben put in the Starlings chat a while back that you know there's a fear of dividing XR or something, but the big thing is that there's so many groups in our area or everywhere that are working towards the same thing, and this excites me because it gives us the opportunity to start to work together to unite. And one thing that we had identified was that actually with all these people, Chris, like your people that you were talking about that are doing bike repair or something, we have an opportunity with all the drama and the flair that we have within XR for Action to actually amplify the work that they're already doing. And that would be no small thing, I think, if you were trying to work hard on that. And I've forgotten what else I was going to say. Oh, all the passive people on our mailing lists, people that really believe in and care about what XR is doing, but don't feel they can go to London and stuff. And when we had the workshop I think it was only in February, there were a lot of people there talking about what they wanted an XR Lite. So it's not just people that are dropping off because they're in that freeze mode, but also people that really want to get involved but want to do something a bit more directly to help their communities. And also I wanted to bring up that this isn't just climate issues, it's social justice, very much social justice. So in our communities, there's so many people suffering, you know, working 2 and 3 jobs, trying to look after the kids, trying to make do. And this offers an opportunity for us to actually really start caring for each other and ignore, you know, you can wait forever for the government. And the last thing I wanted to say was that, yes, we all know about I don't know if we all know about it, but the fright, flight, freeze thing, and what that does to our bodies. A lot of rebels are really, a lot of people are really, really suffering from these things at the moment. And there is a courses being offered for free by a cranial sacral therapist on this. That's really blissful if anybody needs it, by Regen at the moment. That's
lovely. Thank you, Una. Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to the conversation that we were having a little earlier. My sense of this is very much about how we move the story on and how we tell the story of how we live and what we are and what our potential is, and how we encourage, I suppose, you know, people to join the dots and to imagine, you know, what might be possible. And I think that also people can start off quite small and be kind of politicized, if you like, through just engaging in local issues that can build up from that point. So, for example, I've seen people who've been involved in local air campaigns, the campaign to improve the air quality, and from that point build up and build up and build up, and now they're part of, you know, much bigger struggles with XR, and it feels like, you know, this is very much about how we position ourselves and how we tell the story of what we're doing, and tell the story of what other people are doing, and so, yeah, give us all a chance to live the future that we want to be in, actually, and that potential to be there, I think, in our imagination. So that was all.
Thank you, Rachel. Ben, or that's Christina's. Yeah, thank you.
I've got a pseudonym. Yeah, I just like, God, when was it? It was a while back. I had this idea about XR being the fire alarm and transition being the fire brigade. So I've just been recently reading something about systems thinking, and it was talk about how to leverage a system in the right way. And one of the most effective things that you can do is to change the paradigm. So you keep pointing at the failures of the old paradigm and speak and act with assurance from the new one, which kind of seems fits in what I was thinking earlier. Yeah. So I was just wondering if that could be a way forward as well. So keep, you know, the XR, because there's a lot of people in XR who want to do the kind of radical supergluey stuff, but we don't want them to think that the people who don't want to do it aren't, you know, they're kind of too soft or whatever, you know, that sort of thing. So maybe we could do both, where I was thinking about this earlier, where, for example, we kind of an action at a bank where there's lots of people glued on and throwing like fake oil everywhere, but at the same time, like literally 50 meters away, there's a transition style group where they're showing alternative banking with negative interests and gift economy stuff and all that kind of stuff. So it gets people who would look at us and go, oh, crusties again. You know, they kind of look there and they think, there's these mad people, and over here there's these other people who are doing something, and they seem to be the same, but they're completely doing different things. And it might just get the more kind of risk-averse people on board, because they don't have to be part of the arrestable bit, but then they could be showing the new paradigm, which is the way forward that we want. Just thought. Yeah. And you could put free cake and badges as well. So, you know.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of that, Ben. And also, you know, that kind of the idea that risk averse, but actually sometimes it's, you cannot step into that risk because the risk is very different for different people. So it's for people whose the risk is just unable to be stepped into, to have these other options. Did I see you wanted to answer to that, Rupert?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point, which is I really like what was just said there very much. And it resonates with what I was trying to say earlier when I was saying we need to make sure it doesn't feel to people as if you're not arrestable, then you're not a proper rebel. And the trad approach is a really strong way, it seems to me, as was just described, really, of making clear that there really are multiple absolutely necessary roles, and that they really do mutually complement each other in the kind of way that was just described. And we're going to need all of them at scale if we're going to get anywhere close to where we need to be.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. And I recognized as well, Manda put in when Ben was talking about that needing a, you know, stepping into this new paradigm, that of course we need a sense of the new paradigm first. And this is about exploring that, stepping into a new paradigm as if it were true. And therefore, you know, being able to see feel and see a living example of what that might look like, if even on a small scale at first. It gives us concrete ideas to work towards, and not just kind of visionary ideas that seem a bit out of touch with reality. And Chris, did you have your hand up?
Indeed, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's all been really fascinating stuff, and coming from a place of historical activism, sometimes considered, sometimes ill-considered. I think I've really appreciated seeing XR and what it's brought and how it's motivated and inspired people, and the operative word being people, huge amounts of people, at a very deep level as well, with you know, people care kind of at its core, and I really appreciate that. And I think, to me, what this really has to offer is, I mean, yes, I see aspects of keeping XR with the qualities it's had, because it's been very effective at doing that, and it's not any fault of XR that nothing much seems to have changed. Actually, it's a sign of the power that we are facing, or that we're dealing with, and you know, how to get that power off our backs would be, to me, a big function that you know, we could also take on. It's like how to get so bored up about Cargill and the like. And yes, that's what we're up against. We're up against the Boris Johnsons and the Trumps and the, you know, and it's pretty damn big. And I think, you know, both individually and collectively, XR has brought big change, and it can continue to do that. To me, two of the key roles that I think it can also have is, one is signposting to where the good things are happening. So, you know, being the positive news, and, you know, here's the community stuff, here's the farming stuff, here's the transport, the energy, the governance, the sociocracy. You know, we have actually got the answers on all the levels, and a lot of people are waiting to be shown where to go. You know, where are these happening? So all the stuff about the community centres and the like, it's all going to be needed. So it's not either or, it's both and. And the other thing I think that it really needs to, or really can take on board, is how to foster connection to nature. I personally believe that this is one of the roots of the problems that we have, and therefore that's where we need to go to solve it. So how do we foster deep nature connection, so that people can get an idea of A, what we're dealing with, and B, how we can deal with it. So you know, anything that Trad can do for that, for those two things in particular, signposting and fostering or refostering deep nature connection, I think will add to the positive outputs that have already been seen.
Thank you, Chris. And I mean, absolutely. And when we talk about deep collaboration, we're not just talking deep collaboration, people, humans to humans. You know, there is another group also experimenting with the deep collaboration of humans with the other than human. How do we presence that in our meetings, not just in our kind of, you know, our personal lives or our nature connection, but how do we bring it into our working experience and actually share that presence and start to grow the kind of ears that are not just listening for the empathy of people, but are listening with empathy to the other than humans around us, who have been, you know, crying for our attention for a very long time. And if there is any message that comes from Indigenous places around the world, it is stop and listen.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, there are many wonderful and amazing teachers who can take us on those journeys, but it's this kind of, Extinction Rebellion has the eyes of a very big audience at the moment, and it's how do we really normalize this kind of behavior and not make it like it's something to be in the background, you know? something to be kind of ashamed of or hidden in our private lives, but something that's very much present with us and is about us reconnecting, connecting with the land that we are standing on, you know, protecting where it is we stand, and doing that through generating a reconnection with it, courting a connection. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Bye, see you next time.